The crisp autumn air carried a chill that hinted at the coming winter as Emma Clarkson stood on the threshold of her apartment, staring at the ornate cream-colored envelope in her hand. The envelope, though beautifully crafted, felt out of place in the modern world. It had arrived earlier that day, nestled amidst the usual bills and junk mail, its heavy parchment and elegant calligraphy demanding attention. Emma's name was inscribed in a deep, almost black ink that seemed to drink in the light. Emma hesitated, her mind swirling with a mixture of curiosity and unease. It had been years since she last heard from Robert, her enigmatic cousin who had always been something of an oddity in the family. Growing up, they had been close, inseparable even. But as they got older, Robert had withdrawn, retreating into the shadows of his own mind and into the isolated mansion left to him by his late parents. Contact between them had dwindled to nothing more than a few terse emails every couple of years. But now, out of the blue, this. Emma carefully opened the envelope, her fingers trembling slightly as she unfolded the thick, embossed paper within. The letter was handwritten in the same flowing script, and as she read, the words seemed to pulse with an unsettling energy. Dear Emma, I hope this letter finds you well. I know it has been a long time since we last spoke, and for that, I apologize. The truth is, I have been somewhat preoccupied, no, consumed, by a discovery that has changed my life in ways I can scarcely explain. I have found someone, Emma, someone who has brought me immense joy and fulfillment. I would be honored if you would visit me at the mansion and meet her. Her name is Claudia, and I believe you will find her as fascinating as I do. Please come as soon as you can. The mansion has been quite lonely, and it would mean the world to me to see you again. So, with warmest regards, Robert. Emma reread the letter, trying to quell the unease that had begun to creep up her spine. Claudia. The name was unfamiliar, and the tone of Robert's letter was both excited and unsettling. There was an undercurrent to his words that she couldn't quite place, a sense of urgency that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. A dozen questions crowded her mind. Who was this Claudia? Why had Robert reached out after so many years of silence? And what had driven him to invite her to the mansion, a place she remembered as cold, dark, and filled with an oppressive loneliness? Despite her misgivings, Emma found herself packing a small bag. Robert's invitation was too strange to ignore, and despite the years of distance, she still cared deeply for her cousin. Perhaps this visit would provide her with some answers, or at the very least, put her mind at ease. After all, it was just a visit, nothing more. The drive to the mansion was long and winding, taking Emma through stretches of countryside that seemed to grow more desolate the further she went. The vibrant colors of fall slowly gave way to a landscape of twisted trees and fog-shrouded fields, as if nature itself was warning her to turn back. But Emma pressed on, her determination outweighing her trepidation. As she neared the mansion, the sky darkened and the air grew thick with mist. The old wrought-iron gates loomed ahead, covered in creeping ivy that had turned the metal a deep, almost rusted green. Emma slowed the car as the mansion came into view, its towering, Gothic architecture stark against the gloom. The once grand estate now appeared almost lifeless, its windows dark and empty, like the hollow eyes of a long-forgotten relic. She parked the car and stepped out, the gravel crunching underfoot. The mansion seemed to tower over her, its presence as imposing as ever. Memories of childhood visits came flooding back, days spent exploring the endless corridors and shadowy rooms, with Robert always leading the way. But now the mansion felt different, as though it were a living entity that had been waiting, watching for her return. Robert was waiting for her at the front door, a thin figure against the heavy oak. He looked older, more worn than she remembered, with a pallor to his skin that suggested he hadn't seen much sunlight in recent years. His dark hair, once neatly combed, was now slightly disheveled, and his eyes, those deep, unsettling eyes, seemed to burn with an intensity that made Emma's heart skip a beat. "Emma?" he greeted her, his voice warm but edged with something she couldn't quite define. "You came." "Of course," Emma replied, forcing a smile as she stepped forward to embrace him. He felt cold, almost frail, as if he were more a shadow than a man. "It's been too long, Robert." "Yes, far too long," he agreed, pulling back and studying her with those piercing eyes. "I'm so glad you're here. There's so much I want to show you, so much to tell you." As they entered the mansion, Emma was immediately struck by the musty scent of age and disuse. The interior was dimly lit, the grand chandelier overhead casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. The once opulent furnishings were now covered in dust, the colors faded by time. Yet, despite the neglect, the mansion retained a certain eerie beauty, a haunting elegance that sent a shiver down Emma's spine. "Let me take your things," Robert offered, his voice snapping her out of her reverie. "You must be tired from the journey." "Thank you," Emma said, handing over her bag. "I have to admit, Robert, I was surprised to hear from you, and this place... It's just as I remembered, though maybe a bit more empty." Robert smiled faintly, his expression unreadable. "Yes, it has been quiet here, but that will change now that you're here, and soon you'll meet Claudia. She's been eager to meet you, you know." There it was again, that strange tone when he mentioned Claudia. Emma felt a knot tighten in her stomach, but she pushed the feeling aside. She would meet this mysterious woman soon enough, and perhaps then everything would start to make sense. But as she followed Robert deeper into the mansion, the shadows seemed to lengthen, and the silence became deafening, punctuated only by the echo of their footsteps. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong, as if the mansion itself was holding its breath, waiting for the moment to reveal its secrets. And as the night closed in around them, Emma couldn't help but wonder if she had made a terrible mistake in coming here. The morning sun barely penetrated the thick, heavy curtains of Emma's guest room as she awoke, a lingering sense of unease clinging to her from the night before. The air in the mansion was dense with an oppressive stillness, as though the very walls held their breath. She dressed quickly, her mind buzzing with unanswered questions about Robert's behavior and, of course, the mysterious Claudia. Descending the grand staircase, Emma was struck by the eerie silence that pervaded the mansion. The echo of her footsteps seemed unnaturally loud in the vast, empty space. The mansion, once full of life and activity during their childhood summers, now felt like a decaying relic, a place frozen in time and left to rot. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, she paused, noticing for the first time just how many porcelain dolls were scattered throughout the house. They were everywhere, on mantels, nestled in dusty armchairs, perched on bookshelves. Some were small and delicate, while others were unnervingly lifelike, their glassy eyes staring vacantly into the distance. Each doll was unique, dressed in elaborate, old-fashioned clothing, and each seemed to emanate a silent, watchful presence. Emma's skin prickled with unease as she moved through the mansion, the doll's eyes following her every step. She remembered the few dolls that had been around when she was a child, but there had never been this many, and certainly none that looked so disturbingly human. What had happened to Robert? Why had he surrounded himself with these lifeless figures? The urge to find answers grew stronger as she wandered through the maze of hallways. The mansion was vast, its corridors winding and twisting in ways that made it easy to get lost. The deeper she ventured, the more she noticed the strange, unsettling details. Faded portraits whose eyes seemed to follow her, mirrors with tarnished frames reflecting distorted images, and a faint, musty smell that hinted at something long hidden. Finally, she came upon a hallway she didn't remember from her childhood. It was darker here, the walls lined with old, faded tapestries that seemed to absorb the light. At the end of the hallway, a door stood slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness beckoning her inside. Emma hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to turn back, but curiosity won out. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was unlike any other in the mansion, a large, dimly lit space cluttered with strange artifacts and objects that defied explanation. In the center of the room stood a massive workbench covered in porcelain parts, paintbrushes, and an array of intricate tools. The walls were lined with shelves, each one crammed with more porcelain dolls in various stages of assembly. Some were just heads with pale, unpainted faces. Others were fully formed, their eyes blank and their expressions frozen in eerie, lifelike poses. But what caught Emma's attention most was the large, leather-bound journal lying open on the workbench. The pages were filled with detailed sketches of the dolls, accompanied by notes written in Robert's familiar handwriting. The sketches depicted not just the dolls, but also strange symbols and diagrams that Emma couldn't begin to understand. Flipping through the pages, she saw a recurring motif, an intricate sigil that seemed to pulse with a dark energy, scrawled beside the image of a doll that looked hauntingly familiar. It was Claudia. The sketch was unmistakable, the same delicate features, the same flowing hair. But the notes that accompanied the drawing were disturbing, speaking of transference, essence binding, and preservation of the soul. Emma's hands shook as she read the words, her heart pounding in her chest. What was Robert trying to do? What did these notes mean? As she reached the final pages of the journal, Emma's breath caught in her throat. Tucked between the pages was a photograph, old and worn, with the edges curled and yellowed. The photo depicted a young woman, her expression serene, her eyes piercingly clear. She was beautiful, but what struck Emma most was how much the woman resembled Claudia. In fact, it wasn't just a resemblance. Claudia was an exact replica of this woman. Emma felt a cold sweat break out across her skin as the pieces began to fall into place. The newspaper clippings she had seen earlier in another room, detailing the disappearances of several women over the past decade, the strange behavior Robert had exhibited since her arrival, And now this. Was it possible that Claudia was more than just a doll? Could Robert have somehow trapped the essence of these missing women within the porcelain figures? Suddenly, the room felt unbearably claustrophobic, the air thick and stifling. Emma backed away from the workbench, her mind reeling with the implications of what she had discovered. She needed to confront Robert, to demand answers. But even as she thought it, fear gnawed at her insides. What if Robert had become something darker, something far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined? Emma turned to leave, but as she did, her gaze fell upon a small, ornate box on a nearby shelf. Something about the box called to her, compelling her to open it. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the cold metal latch. The box creaked open, revealing a velvet-lined interior with several small vials of an unknown, shimmering liquid. As Emma stared at the vials, a soft creaking sound came from behind her. She spun around, her heart racing, but saw nothing. The room was empty, save for the countless dolls watching her in silence. But Emma could feel it, the palpable sensation of being watched, not just by the dolls, but by something else, something unseen. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to leave the mansion and never look back. But she was too deep into this mystery now, too entwined in whatever dark secret Robert had buried within these walls. She needed to find out the truth, no matter what it cost her. Clutching the journal tightly, Emma made her way back down the dark hallway, her pulse pounding in her ears. As she approached the main part of the mansion, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had disturbed something that should have remained hidden. The air around her seemed to hum with a sinister energy, the walls closing in on her, as if the mansion itself was alive and aware of her intrusion. And as she reached the grand staircase, she stopped dead in her tracks. Standing at the top, bathed in the dim light filtering through the dusty windows, was Claudia. The doll's head was slightly tilted, its glassy eyes staring directly at Emma, as though it had been waiting for her all along. Emma's breath hitched as the realization struck her. Claudia wasn't just a doll. She was something far more terrifying, something that defied logic and reason. And whatever she was, Emma knew one thing for certain. She had to get out of this mansion before it was too late. But deep down, she also knew that leaving wouldn't be that simple. Not when the mansion's secrets had already begun to unravel around her, pulling her into their dark, inescapable grip. The wind howled outside the mansion that night, rattling the windows as Emma lay wide awake in bed. The oppressive darkness of the room seemed to press down on her, making it impossible to sleep. Her mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion, replaying the day's discoveries over and over again. The journal, the photograph, the strange vials. All of it pointed to something deeply wrong, something that made her stomach churn with dread. But it was Claudia who haunted her thoughts the most. The doll's lifeless eyes, the uncanny resemblance to the woman in the photograph, and the way she seemed to appear in the most unsettling places. Emma shuddered as she remembered the way Claudia had been standing at the top of the stairs, as if waiting for her. Unable to bear the oppressive silence any longer, Emma threw off the covers and slipped out of bed. She needed answers, and she needed them now. There was no use lying in the dark, stewing in her fear. If she wanted to know the truth, she would have to confront Robert directly. But as she made her way down the darkened hallway, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The shadows seemed to shift and move around her, whispering in a language she couldn't understand. It was as if the mansion itself was alive, watching her every move, waiting for the right moment to strike. Emma paused outside Robert's door, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for whatever she might find on the other side. But before she could turn the knob, a soft creaking sound echoed down the hallway. She froze, her heart racing. The sound had come from behind her, near the stairs. Slowly, she turned around, her breath catching in her throat. Claudia was standing at the end of the hallway, her delicate porcelain face partially obscured by shadows. The doll's head was tilted at an unnatural angle, her glassy eyes fixed on Emma. For a moment, Emma felt paralyzed, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. It wasn't possible. Claudia was just a doll. She couldn't move on her own. But as the doll took a slow, deliberate step toward her, Emma knew she was wrong. Panic surged through her, and she stumbled backward, nearly tripping over her own feet. The hallway seemed to stretch out before her, the shadows deepening and closing in around her. She could hear her own ragged breathing, the blood pounding in her ears. But the only other sound was the soft click of porcelain against the wooden floor as Claudia continued her slow, relentless approach. Emma's mind raced, desperately trying to find a rational explanation. Maybe she was dreaming, or maybe it was the darkness playing tricks on her. But deep down, she knew the truth. This was no illusion. Claudia was alive, or something close to it, and she was coming for her. With a surge of adrenaline, Emma turned and bolted down the hallway, her bare feet slapping against the cold floor. She could hear the doll's footsteps quicken behind her, keeping pace with her no matter how fast she ran. It was as if the mansion itself was conspiring against her, stretching the hallway out endlessly, trapping her in a nightmare from which there was no escape. Finally, she reached the grand staircase and took the steps, 2 at a time, nearly losing her balance as she descended. The darkness seemed thicker here, more suffocating, as if it was swallowing up the light and leaving her blind. But she didn't stop, didn't dare look back. All she could think about was getting as far away from Claudia as possible. She reached the bottom of the stairs and darted into the sitting room, slamming the door shut behind her. Her chest heaved with each labored breath as she pressed her back against the door, praying that it would hold. For a moment there was only silence, the kind that presses in on you, demanding to be broken. But then, the door shuddered as something on the other side pressed against it, testing its strength. Emma's heart raced as she looked around the room, searching for something, anything, she could use to defend herself. The sitting room was dimly lit by the flickering fire in the hearth, casting long shadows across the walls. The room was filled with old furniture, the kind that had been in the mansion for decades, and the ever-present porcelain dolls, their lifeless eyes reflecting the firelight. One of the dolls sat in an armchair by the fire, its head tilted in an eerily familiar way. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she recognized it. It was Claudia. But that was impossible. She had just seen Claudia upstairs in the hallway. How could she be here too? The realization hit her like a cold wave. There wasn't just one Claudia. There were many, and they were all watching her. The door behind her creaked ominously as whatever was on the other side pressed harder. almost as if it was trying to force its way in. Emma's pulse pounded in her ears as she backed away from the door, her eyes locked on the doll in the armchair. She knew she had to do something, anything, to break the spell that held the mansion in its grip. But what? The journal, the notes about transference and preservation. There had to be something in there that could help her, something she'd missed in her panic. Suddenly, the door burst open, and Emma whirled around, her breath catching in her throat. But there was no one there. No doll, no shadowy figure, just the empty, yawning darkness of the hallway beyond. Trembling, Emma turned back to the fireplace, her eyes darting to the mantel above it. The journal wasn't there, but something else caught her attention. A small, ornate mirror hanging on the wall. Its surface was covered in a thin layer of dust, but beneath it she could see her reflection, pale and wide-eyed with fear. But there was something else in the mirror, too. A shape, a shadow standing just behind her, its form dark and indistinct. Emma's blood ran cold as she realized what it was. Claudia's shadow, looming over her, reaching for her. With a strangled cry, Emma spun around, her hands groping for something to defend herself with. But there was nothing, no shadow, no doll, nothing but the empty room and the crackling fire. Emma's breath came in short, panicked gasps as she backed away from the mirror, her mind reeling. She had to find Robert, had to confront him, force him to explain what was happening in this cursed place. But even as she thought it, a deeper fear took hold of her. What if Robert was the one who had set this nightmare in motion? What if he was the one who had brought Claudia to life? The mansion seemed to groan around her, the walls shifting and closing in. Emma could feel it now, the presence that permeated every corner of the house, watching her, waiting for her to fall into its trap. She had to get out, had to escape before it was too late. But as she made her way back toward the staircase, the shadows seemed to deepen, stretching out to meet her, pulling her back into the darkness. And just before she reached the stairs, she saw it again. Claudia, standing at the top, her eyes gleaming with a cold, unnatural light. There was no escape. Not from this house, not from Claudia, not from the dark force that had taken hold of them all. Emma's only hope now was to uncover the mansion's darkest secret, to find out what Robert had done, and to put an end to it, before the shadows consumed her too. Claudia's shadow loomed ever closer, and Emma knew that whatever lay ahead, she would have to face it alone. The morning light filtered weakly through the mansion's heavy drapes, casting long, ominous shadows across the room. Emma stood at the window, her thoughts racing as she tried to piece together the fragments of the nightmare that had unfolded the night before. She hadn't slept. Every creak, every whisper of the wind against the old walls had kept her on edge, her mind replaying the terrifying encounter with Claudia's shadow. She knew now that she couldn't stay in the mansion much longer, but leaving without answers wasn't an option either. Whatever darkness had taken root in this place, it was connected to Claudia, and Emma had to understand it. Had to uncover the truth about the doll, about the mansion, and about Robert's role in all of it. Her thoughts drifted back to the journal she had found in the workshop, the pages filled with disturbing notes about transference and preservation. The words had haunted her, lingering in the back of her mind, intertwining with the memory of the photograph she had discovered. A photograph of a woman who looked exactly like Claudia. And then there were the newspaper clippings she had found in the locked room. The women who had vanished over the past decade, all of them shared a striking resemblance to Claudia, as if they were different versions of the same person. The implications were horrifying. Could Robert have been involved in these disappearances? Had he somehow used the women to bring Claudia to life? The thought made Emma's blood run cold, but she couldn't ignore the evidence that was piling up. She had to dig deeper, no matter how much she feared what she might find. Determined, Emma decided to start with the town itself. The mansion was isolated, but the small town of Ashton Hollow was just a short drive away. If these women had gone missing, there had to be records, reports, something that could shed light on their fates. Emma needed to find out who they were, where they had lived, and what had happened to them before they vanished. She found Robert in the study, poring over some old books. He looked up as she entered, his face lighting up with a warm smile that only deepened her unease. "Good morning, Emma," he said, his voice filled with a strange, unsettling cheerfulness. "I hope you slept well." Emma forced a smile in return. Though her mind was filled with 1,000 questions, she wasn't ready to ask him. Not yet. "Morning, Robert. Actually, I was thinking of going into town today. It's been so long since I've been here, and I thought it might be nice to see the old place again." Robert's smile faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered. "Of course, Ashton Hollow is as quaint as ever, but are you sure you want to go alone? I could come with you." Emma shook her head, hoping her nervousness didn't show. "I'll be fine. I just need some fresh air, and I'd like to explore on my own. We can catch up when I get back." Robert hesitated, a flicker of something dark passing through his eyes, but he nodded. "Very well, just be careful. The town isn't what it used to be." Emma didn't miss the edge in his voice, but she didn't push. She needed space to think, and she needed answers. Answers she was increasingly certain Robert wasn't going to give her willingly. The drive into town was short, but the closer Emma got, the more she felt a sense of foreboding. The town of Ashton Hollow had always been small, but now it looked almost deserted, as if time had passed it by and left it to decay. The streets were quiet, the few shops that remained open had an air of neglect, and the people she saw walking about kept their heads down, avoiding eye contact. Emma parked her car near the town's small library, its brick facade crumbling with age. She hoped that here, in the dusty archives of Ashton Hollow's past, she might find some clue to the mystery of the vanishing women. The library was as quiet as the rest of the town, its interior dim and musty. A single librarian, an elderly woman with thick glasses and a stern expression, sat behind the counter. She barely glanced up as Emma entered. Emma approached the counter, her nerves jangling. "Excuse me, I was hoping to look at some old newspapers, maybe some public records. I'm doing some research on a few people who lived here about 10 years ago." The librarian's gaze flicked up, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied Emma. "What kind of research?" Emma hesitated. She needed to tread carefully. "Family history. My cousin and I are trying to piece together some genealogy, and we're curious about some old family friends who lived here." The librarian seemed to accept this explanation, though Emma could tell she was still suspicious. "The archives are in the back," she said, her voice clipped. "Not many people come to look through them these days." "Thank you." Emma said, offering a polite smile before making her way to the back of the library. The archive room was small, filled with old wooden filing cabinets and shelves lined with yellowing newspapers and brittle records. Emma set to work, sifting through the dust-covered files, searching for any mention of the women she had seen in the clippings. It took hours of painstaking work, but finally, Emma began to piece together a disturbing pattern. The women who had vanished had all been young, attractive, and new to Ashton Hollow. Most had moved to the town for work or a fresh start, and all of them had gone missing within a year of their arrival. The local authorities had investigated, but there had been no leads, no bodies, nothing to explain their disappearances. Emma's heart pounded as she flipped through the pages of the old newspapers, each article more chilling than the last. The reports were vague, almost dismissive, as if the town had wanted to forget these women as quickly as possible. But one detail stood out. Each woman had been last seen near the outskirts of town, close to the mansion. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she realized the full implications. These women had all come into contact with Robert in some way. Could he really have been responsible for their disappearances? And if so, what had he done to them? As she dug deeper, Emma found one name that appeared again and again in the investigation notes: Agnes Pendleton. Agnes had been a local shopkeeper who had gone missing shortly after a mysterious fire destroyed her store. Her name had been mentioned in connection with each of the missing women, as she had been one of the last people to see them alive. But like the others, Agnes had vanished without a trace, and her disappearance had never been solved. Emma's pulse quickened. She needed to find out more about Agnes. If she could uncover what had happened to her, maybe she could finally get to the bottom of this nightmare. Leaving the library, Emma wandered the town streets, hoping to find someone who might remember Agnes Pendleton. But the few people she approached either didn't know or didn't want to talk about the past. It was as if the town had collectively agreed to forget the disappearances, to bury them along with the memories of those who were lost. Finally, in a small, cluttered antique shop, Emma found a lead. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with a kind face and a sharp memory, recalled Agnes Pendleton vividly. She was a lovely woman, the shopkeeper said, his voice tinged with sadness. Always had a smile for everyone. She ran the general store for years, kept it going through the hard times. But after that fire, well, she just disappeared. Some folks said she left town, couldn't bear to stay after losing everything, but I never believed that. Agnes was too strong for that. Emma pressed him for more information, and the shopkeeper hesitated, glancing around the empty shop before lowering his voice. There were rumors, you know. Whispers that something wasn't right at that mansion up on the hill. People said they saw strange things. Figures in the windows at night, shadows moving where there shouldn't be any. And then there were the screams, carried on the wind. But no one wanted to say it out loud. Too afraid, I suppose. Emma's heart pounded as the shopkeeper's words sank in. The mansion, Robert's mansion, was at the center of it all. The disappearances, the strange occurrences, everything pointed back to that cursed place. She thanked the shopkeeper and hurried back to her car, her mind racing. She had to return to the mansion, had to confront Robert and demand the truth. But as she drove back, a cold fear settled over her. What if the truth was worse than she could imagine? What if Robert was involved in something far darker than she had ever suspected? The mansion loomed ahead, its dark silhouette standing stark against the gray sky. Emma parked the car and steeled herself. Whatever secrets Robert was hiding, she would uncover them. She had no choice now. She was in too deep, and there was no turning back. As she entered the mansion, the air inside felt heavier, as if it had absorbed the weight of all the secrets it held. The shadows seemed to press in around her, growing darker, more suffocating. Emma's resolve wavered, but she forced herself to push forward. She would find Robert, and she would get the answers she needed, no matter what it cost her. She moved through the mansion with a sense of purpose, heading toward the workshop where she had found the journal. But as she approached, she heard voices. Robert's voice, soft and soothing, but with an edge that sent a chill down her spine. Emma crept closer, careful not to make a sound, until she reached the door. It was ajar, and through the crack, she could see Robert standing by the workbench, his back to her. He was talking to someone, or something. "Claudia," he whispered, his voice filled with an unsettling tenderness. "You don't need to worry. Everything is as it should be. Soon everything will be perfect." Emma's breath caught in her throat as she saw what, or who, Robert was speaking to. Claudia was sitting on the workbench, her porcelain face eerily serene, her eyes fixed on Robert as if she were truly listening. But there was something different about her now, something more lifelike, more human. Emma's stomach twisted in horror as she realized what was happening. Robert had been using the missing women to bring Claudia to life, trapping their souls, their essence, within the porcelain doll. And now Claudia was almost complete, almost fully alive. She couldn't stay hidden any longer. Emma pushed open the door, her voice trembling with anger and fear. "Robert, what have you done?" Robert turned to face her, his eyes wide with surprise, then narrowing with a cold, almost malevolent intensity. "Emma," he said calmly, as if her presence was entirely expected. "You shouldn't have come here." Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she took a step forward, her voice rising. "Those women, Agnes, all the others, what have you done to them? How could you?" "They're part of something greater now," Robert interrupted, his tone detached, almost clinical. "Claudia is special. She needs them, and soon she'll be complete." Emma felt a wave of nausea wash over her as she realized what he meant. Claudia wasn't just a doll, she was an abomination, a creature made from the stolen lives of innocent women. And Robert, her own cousin, had orchestrated it all. "You're insane," Emma whispered, her voice shaking. "You can't do this. You have to stop." But Robert only smiled, a twisted, cold smile that sent shivers down Emma's spine. "It's too late to stop, Emma. Claudia is nearly ready, and once she's complete, we'll be together. Forever." Emma backed away, her mind racing for a way out. She had to escape, had to get out of the mansion and get help. But as she turned to flee, Robert's voice rang out behind her, cold and commanding. "Don't leave, Emma. Not when we're so close." The door slammed shut in front of her, and Emma whirled around to see Robert standing in the doorway, his eyes dark and determined. "You were always meant to be part of this, Emma. You were always meant to help me." Emma's heart raced as she realized the terrible truth. She wasn't just an outsider in this nightmare. She was the final piece of Robert's twisted plan. And unless she found a way to stop him, she would become the next victim, the next soul to be trapped in Claudia's porcelain prison. But Emma wasn't ready to give up. She wasn't ready to let Robert win. She took a deep breath, her resolve hardening, and stared him down. "I'm not going to let you do this, Robert. I'm going to stop you." Robert's smile faltered, and for a moment, Emma saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. But then he stepped forward, his expression hardening with resolve. "You're too late, Emma. Claudia will be complete, and you will join her." Emma didn't wait for him to make the first move. She turned and ran, her heart pounding in her chest as she sprinted down the hallway, the sound of Robert's footsteps echoing behind her. She had to find a way out, had to escape before it was too late. But as she ran, the shadows seemed to close in around her, growing darker, more suffocating. The walls of the mansion twisted and warped, as if the house itself was conspiring against her, trapping her in its dark embrace. Emma could feel Claudia's presence, cold and malevolent, lurking just behind her, waiting for the moment to strike. But she wouldn't let it happen. She wouldn't let herself become another victim, another soul lost to the darkness. She reached the grand staircase and took the steps 2 at a time, her legs burning with the effort. But as she reached the top, she felt a cold hand grip her ankle, and she stumbled, falling to her knees. Claudia's shadow loomed over her, its porcelain face twisted in a grotesque parody of a smile. Emma's heart raced with terror as she realized there was no escape, no way out of this nightmare. But she couldn't give up. Not now. Not when she was so close. With a surge of adrenaline, Emma kicked out at the shadowy figure, breaking free from its grip. She scrambled to her feet and continued running, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She had to get out of the mansion. She had to escape before it was too late. But as she reached the front door, she found it locked, the keyhole filled with darkness. Emma's heart sank as she realized there was no way out, no way to escape the horrors that awaited her. And then she felt it, a cold, creeping presence that filled the room, closing in around her. Claudia's shadow, dark and malevolent, was right behind her, reaching out to claim her soul. Emma knew she had only moments left. She turned to face the shadow, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and prepared to fight with everything she had. But before she could make a move, the door burst open, and light flooded the room. A figure stepped into the doorway, silhouetted against the bright sunlight. Emma's heart leapt with hope as she recognized the figure, Agnes Pendleton, the woman who had vanished years ago, but who now stood before her, alive and determined. "Emma," Agnes called, her voice strong and clear. "Come with me." Emma didn't hesitate. She ran to Agnes, her heart pounding with relief. And together they fled the mansion, leaving the darkness and the shadows behind. As they reached the safety of the outside world, Emma glanced back at the mansion, its dark silhouette standing stark against the bright sky. The shadows inside seemed to writhe and twist, as if angry at being denied their prey. But Emma didn't look back for long. She had escaped the mansion, escaped the darkness that had nearly consumed her. And now, with Agnes by her side, she knew she would find a way to stop Robert and end his twisted plan once and for all. The vanishing women, the secrets of the mansion, the dark presence that had haunted her, they were all pieces of a puzzle that Emma was determined to solve. and she wouldn't stop until she had uncovered the truth and put an end to the horrors that had taken so many lives. The sun was setting as Emma and Agnes made their way back to the mansion, the sky burning with the deep, fiery hues of twilight. The air was thick with tension, and every step they took seemed to reverberate with the anticipation of what lay ahead. Emma's heart pounded with a mixture of fear and determination, her mind racing with the knowledge that this was it, the moment she would finally face Robert and put an end to the nightmare that had consumed her life. Beside her, Agnes moved with a quiet resolve, her face set in a grim expression. Emma had learned much about Agnes during their brief escape, how she had managed to survive Robert's attempts to bind her soul to Claudia, how she had escaped the mansion but had remained hidden, waiting for the right moment to return. Agnes had been the key to Emma's survival, but now, as they approached the looming silhouette of the mansion, Emma knew that the real battle was just beginning. The mansion stood dark and foreboding against the deepening night, its windows like hollow eyes watching their approach. The oppressive atmosphere seemed to grow thicker with each passing second, the shadows stretching and twisting as if they were alive. Emma could feel the presence of the mansion's dark secrets pressing down on her, but she refused to back down. She had come too far to turn away now. "We have to find Robert," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind that had begun to pick up. "We have to stop him before it's too late." Agnes nodded, her eyes fixed on the mansion's entrance. "He'll be in the workshop. That's where it all began, and where it must end." Emma swallowed hard, her mouth dry with fear. She could still remember the twisted expression on Robert's face, the cold determination in his eyes when he had spoken of completing Claudia. He had gone too far, lost himself in the dark rituals that had consumed him, and now he was a threat not just to Emma and Agnes, but to anyone who crossed his path. As they approached the front door, Emma hesitated, her hand trembling as she reached for the doorknob. The door creaked open under her touch, the sound echoing ominously through the silent night. She exchanged a glance with Agnes, who gave her a reassuring nod. Together, they stepped into the darkened mansion, the door closing behind them with a heavy, final thud. The interior of the mansion was suffused with a chilling darkness, the air thick with the scent of decay. The shadows seemed to pulse and shift around them, as if the house itself was alive, watching their every move. The familiar, unsettling silence pressed in on them, broken only by the soft creak of the floorboards underfoot. Emma led the way through the twisting corridors, her heart pounding in her chest. Every corner, every darkened doorway felt like a potential ambush, but she forced herself to keep moving. The memory of Claudia's shadowy presence loomed large in her mind, and she knew that the doll would not be far away. But it was Robert who she feared most, the man who had once been her cousin, but had now become something far more dangerous. They reached the door to the workshop, and Emma paused, her breath catching in her throat. She could feel the dark energy radiating from the room beyond, a malevolent force that seemed to seep through the walls and wrap itself around her. She steeled herself, her hand tightening around the doorknob, and with a nod from Agnes, she pushed the door open. The workshop was dimly lit by the flickering light of a dozen candles, their flames casting eerie shadows across the room. The sight that greeted them was a tableau of horror, porcelain dolls in various stages of assembly, lay scattered across the workbench, their lifeless eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. The walls were lined with strange, arcane symbols, drawn in what looked like blood, and in the center of the room stood a large, ornate mirror that seemed to pulse with a dark, otherworldly energy. And there, standing before the mirror with his back to them, was Robert. He was murmuring softly to himself, his hands moving in strange, deliberate motions as he traced the symbols on the mirror's surface. The air around him seemed to shimmer and distort, as if reality itself was bending to his will. Emma could feel the malevolence radiating from him, a dark power that had twisted and corrupted the man she had once known. "Robert," Emma's voice rang out, sharp and clear in the oppressive silence. Robert froze, his hands stilling in mid-motion. Slowly he turned to face them, his expression calm and composed, but his eyes burning with an unnatural intensity. "Emma," he said softly, his voice carrying a strange, almost hypnotic cadence. "I was hoping you'd come. It's time to finish what we started." Emma's heart ached at the sight of him, the man she had once cared for, now a stranger, lost to the darkness that had consumed him. "Robert, this has to stop. You can't go through with this, Claudia. She's not real. She's not alive." Robert's smile was cold, devoid of any warmth. "You don't understand, Emma. Claudia is more than just a doll. She is the culmination of years of work, years of devotion. She is everything." "Robert, look around you," Agnes said, stepping forward, her voice firm. "This isn't life. It's madness. These women, the ones you've taken, they didn't deserve this. They're trapped, Robert, trapped in a nightmare you created." But Robert shook his head, his gaze shifting to the mirror behind him. "They're not trapped. They're free. Claudia has given them purpose, and now she will be complete." With that, Robert turned back to the mirror, raising his hands once more to trace the symbols. The mirror began to glow with a dark light, the air around it crackling with energy. Emma felt a surge of panic. Whatever Robert was about to do, she knew it would be irreversible. "No!" Emma shouted, rushing forward to stop him, but Robert was faster. He raised his hand, and with a wave, Emma was thrown back by an unseen force, slamming into the wall with a cry of pain. Agnes rushed to her side, helping her to her feet as Robert continued his ritual, the mirror's light growing brighter, more intense. Emma's vision blurred with tears of pain and fear. She knew they were running out of time. If Robert completed the ritual, Claudia would become something far more dangerous, far more powerful than they could handle. But how could they stop him? He was too strong, too consumed by the dark power he had harnessed. Then Emma remembered the vials she had found in the ornate box in the workshop, the shimmering liquid inside them, the essence of the women who had disappeared. If she could somehow use it, perhaps she could reverse the ritual, free the trapped souls, and stop Robert before it was too late. "Agnes," Emma gasped, clutching her arm. "The vials, the ones in the box. We need them." Agnes's eyes widened in understanding, and she nodded, quickly moving to the shelf where the box had been stored. But as she reached for it, the air around them seemed to thicken, and a cold, malevolent presence filled the room. Claudia. The doll stepped out of the shadows, her porcelain face twisted into a grotesque smile, her glassy eyes gleaming with a dark, unnatural light. She moved with an eerie, almost graceful fluidity, her steps soundless as she approached Agnes, her intent clear. "Agnes, watch out!" Emma shouted, but it was too late. Claudia lunged at Agnes, her porcelain hands outstretched, and in that moment Emma saw the full horror of what Claudia had become, a vessel of pure, unbridled malevolence, a being that thrived on the pain and suffering of others. But Agnes was quick, grabbing one of the vials from the box and throwing it at Claudia. The vial shattered against the doll's chest, and the liquid inside splashed across her porcelain skin. Claudia shrieked, a high-pitched, inhuman wail that reverberated through the room, and the light in her eyes flickered and dimmed. Emma took her chance, grabbing the remaining vials and rushing to the mirror where Robert was still chanting, oblivious to the chaos around him. She uncorked the vials and threw the contents onto the mirror, hoping against hope that it would be enough to disrupt the ritual. For a moment, nothing happened. The mirror continued to glow, the symbols pulsing with dark energy. But then, slowly, the light began to fade, the energy draining away as the liquid spread across the mirror's surface, erasing the symbols. Robert's chanting faltered, his eyes widening in horror as he realized what was happening. "No!" he shouted, reaching out to stop Emma, but it was too late. With a final, agonized scream, the mirror shattered, the dark energy exploding outward in a violent burst that knocked Emma and Agnes to the ground. The air crackled with the remnants of the dark power, but then, just as suddenly, it was gone, leaving behind only silence. Emma struggled to her feet, her body aching from the impact. She looked around, her heart pounding, but the workshop was empty. The dolls, the strange symbols, the dark presence, all of it had vanished. But Robert was still there, lying on the floor beside the shattered mirror. His face was pale, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. He reached out weakly, his voice a whisper. "Claudia." Emma knelt beside him, her heart heavy with sorrow. "Robert, it's over. She's gone." Robert's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment Emma saw a flicker of the man he had once been, before the darkness had consumed him. I just wanted to save her, to bring her back." Emma shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "She's gone, Robert. You have to let her go." Robert's hand fell to his side, his eyes closing, as he let out a shuddering breath. "I'm sorry, Emma. I'm so sorry." With that, he was gone, his body growing still as the last remnants of the dark energy dissipated from the room. Emma knelt there for a long time, the weight of what had happened pressing down on her, the reality of it all sinking in. Agnes came to her side, her expression filled with a mixture of sadness and relief. "It's over," she said softly. "You did it." But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. She glanced around the workshop, her eyes lingering on the shattered mirror, the place where Claudia had stood. The darkness had been banished, but the scars it had left behind would never fully heal. "We need to get out of here," Emma said finally, her voice trembling. "We need to leave this place behind, forever." Agnes nodded, helping Emma to her feet. Together they left the workshop, the mansion's dark corridors feeling less oppressive now, as if the weight of the secrets they had uncovered had finally been lifted. As they stepped out into the cool night air, Emma felt a sense of closure, but also a deep, lingering sadness. The mansion had been a place of nightmares, but it had also been a place of memories. Memories of a time when she and Robert had been close before the darkness had taken him. They didn't look back as they walked away from the mansion, leaving its dark history behind. But Emma knew that the events of the past few days would stay with her forever, a reminder of the darkness that could exist within even the most familiar places, and the price that sometimes had to be paid to confront it. As they reached the edge of the property, Emma paused, turning back one last time to look at the mansion, now just a shadowy silhouette against the night sky. The darkness that had once consumed it was gone, but the memory of what had happened there would never fade. She took a deep breath, then turned to Agnes, who was watching her with understanding eyes. "Let's go," Emma said softly. Together they walked away from the mansion. The final chapter of their nightmare closed, but the memories of it forever etched in their hearts.